And then he wants to go all the way to Medina because he wants to dig up the Prophet Muhammad's bones and take them back to the Crusader states. When Salahuddin left his brother as the governor of Egypt, when he realizes what's happening, he takes the Egyptian fleet and they chase down Renaud's fleet and they capture it. They sink the fleet, they capture it, they stop this from happening. But now Salahuddin's incensed. He's like, dude, what are you doing? You were going to go dig up our prophets? Like, he can't imagine it. And it breaks his mind.
Okay, so how does Salahuddin come on the scene?
So, Amalric is the king of Jerusalem. And he takes over from Baldwin III. So, what does that make him? 4 or 5? Is he the fifth or sixth Crusader king? And Amalric gets... The Crusaders had just captured Ascalon a few years earlier. And Ascalon, the Crusaders believed, was necessary to own if they were ever going to invade Egypt. And that's what Amalric wants to do. He wants to conquer Egypt.
Okay,
so in 11...
Just before we move on, so Ashkelon is this place just outside of Gaza, currently called Ashkelon, right?
Same thing. Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Which is interesting because the Crusaders just really wanted Ascalon and they kept attacking, and they finally get it. And they became obsessed with it in a very unhealthy way. Anyway, they had captured it just a few years, I want to say it was 5 years earlier. So Amalric now believes he has the ability to invade Egypt. So in 1163, he does. He invades Egypt. He goes to the city of Bilbais. Bilbais is... The ancient Egyptians built a canal from the Nile to where Suez is today. So you could start anywhere in the Mediterranean, go through that canal, and end up in the Red Sea. And I know everybody thinks the French did it in the 1900s, or in the 1800s. They did it again. The original canal was built like 4,500 years ago. Bilbais is on that canal, and in many ways it's kind of it's the city that controls it because it was like halfway between the Nile and Suez. So he goes to Bilbais, he puts the city under siege. There is nothing that the Egyptian population can do to stop him, and it's time for the annual floods. So the Egyptians sneak out of the city and they go out to the dikes to control the floods, and they just break holes in them, and the whole area floods. And the Crusader army is in waist-deep water trying to figure out what to do. So Amalric retreats. He was defeated by the Egyptian floods. He decides to invade again the next year. What happened was the Wazir of Egypt, his name was Shawar, was overthrown. He was defeated in a coup d'etat by a guy named Dirgham. And so Shawar went to Syria and begged Nuruddin for help. Nuruddin doesn't want to do it, but Ayub, the guy that saved Nuruddin's dad Zenki, his brother is a man named Shirkuh. Shirkuh is this Kurd who he was kind of short. He's overweight because he liked to eat too much. He's an alcoholic. He cussed. He loved to brawl. He was a womanizer. He was missing an eye. He lost it in a brawl. He picked a fight with a group of his own men just because he was bored one day, and he loses his eye. He's gruff. He's always angry. He's sarcastic. Nuruddin loved him. Like they were like best friends. They're complete opposites in every way. Like Shirkuh never goes to mosque. He never prays. Nuruddin is 5 times a day. It's just, there's always a smell of alcohol on Shirkuh's breath. They're opposites in every way. Best friends. Shirkuh goes to Nuruddin and goes, let me do it. I'm going to go to Egypt. I'm going to put Shawar back into power. Nuruddin says, this is insane. I don't want to risk an army for this. Shirkuh goes, I just need 2,000 men. I'm that good. And everybody knew he was militarily brilliant. He might be able to pull off a crazy invasion of Egypt with 2,000 men, so they send him. And so Shirkuh says, I need a relative to be my lieutenant. And so he goes to Ayub's son. Ayub's son happens to be Salahuddin. And he says, you're going to be my lieutenant on this expedition to Egypt. And Salahuddin goes, if you made me the king of Egypt, I don't want to go to Egypt. I want nothing to do with Egypt. And Shirkuh goes, this is an order, I'm not asking. So Salahuddin is dragged along. He's like 26 years old. And the problem is you can't get from Syria to Egypt without walking through Crusader state territory. And they can't go by sea because the Crusaders own the port cities. So they're gonna have to sneak through Crusader territory, past Crusader forts. So they have to time their march so that at night is when they're passing the Crusader forts, and they have to be really quiet. And then in the daytime, they run through the open spaces and then camp, and then at night they sneak past the forts again. And that's what they do. It takes them like 2 weeks to get to Egypt. When they get to Cairo, is a brand new city, right? Like Cairo is the baby in the Middle East. I mean, I guess Dubai is the new baby, but for the longest time, Cairo is the baby. It was only founded in 969, right? So it's barely over 1,000 years old. It's a joke. You know what I mean? Like Egyptian cities are 4,000 years old. So having a 5,000 years old, 6,000 years old, so having Cairo be so young is so weird. Anyway, Fustat was the actual capital. It wasn't Cairo. And Fustat was the city that Amr ibn al-As had founded when he conquered Egypt, the Arab who conquered Egypt in the 7th century. And so but Cairo is just north of it. And the Fatimids were hoping to make Cairo into the new capital. They built this grand palace there, and they were moving government assets to Cairo, but it was taking time. So they get there. Dirham's army disintegrates. They have no loyalty to him. He's basically hunted down and killed, and Shawar's put back into power. Shawar had promised that he would give 1/3 of Egypt's revenue every year to Syria if they put him back into power. He gets back into power, and he tells Shirkuh, it's time for you to leave and go back to Syria. And Shirkuh goes, yeah, but I need the money you promised, and I think I should stay here so that you can give me the money every year, and then I'll have it sent back to Syria. And Shawar goes, I've actually asked King Amalric, the king of Jerusalem, to bring an army to come dig you out, and I'll just wait for you to leave. In other words, Shawar backstabs Shirkuh. Shirkuh actually ends up going into Bilbais again. Amalric puts him under siege. Long story short, neither side can win. They can't capture the city, and the city can't escape. They're running out of food. They negotiate a deal that both Amalric and Shirkuh will leave. So they do. Then, in 1167, Amalric invades Egypt again. So it's 3 years later, and his goal is to actually defeat Shawar and conquer Egypt and add Egypt to the Crusader states. I know we don't have time to go into all the details. Long story short, Shirkuh runs around Egypt. They capture Alexandria. Salahuddin is the defender in Alexandria while Shirkuh is doing raids. It's complete chaos. Alexandria is running out of food. They don't know how to hold out. And Amalric decides to make a deal with Shawar. And this new deal, Shawar is going to pay the Crusader states an annual amount of money. Shirkuh will be allowed to leave, so he leaves with Salahuddin. And Amalric will leave a garrison behind in both Cairo and Alexandria. And so in a way, Amalric wins. He makes Egypt into a vassal state. In at the end of 1168, so December of 1168, January of 1169, Shirkuh invades again. This time his goal is to liberate Egypt from Amalric's rule. Amalric does something really strange. He massacres the city of Bilbais. He kills everybody in it. And then he goes to Tanis and he murders all the Egyptians in Tanis. And then he starts marching towards Fustat, the capital. And Shawar panics. He orders everybody out of Fustat and he burns his own capital to the ground because he wants to show the Crusaders how serious he is and he doesn't want the Crusaders to capture it. Shirkuh shows up with an army with Salahuddin at his side again, and the Coptic Church was trying to stay neutral because the Coptic Church was, worried the Crusaders might win, and then what happens to them? But also they were confused because, well, aren't the Crusaders fellow Christians? But at the same time, they had a really good relationship with the Fatimid government, so they were trying to, sit on this once Bilbays is massacred, the Coptic Church goes over to Shirkuh and they go, we are on your side. We will back you to the end. We hate the Crusaders. We want nothing to do with them. And again, not a long story short, they capture Shawar. Salahuddin does. Salahuddin kills Shawar. They make Shirkuh the Wazir. So it's 1169. I think he became Wazir in February of 1169. Amalric realizes he's outmatched now because the Syrian and Egyptian armies get merged together under Shirkuh's command. And so Amalric withdraws from Egypt. Shirkuh stayed as Wazir for 2 months. He dies from a throat complication. It's been suggested based on his symptoms that he had quinsy, like tonsillitis. A tonsillitis killed him. It's such a dumb death for a warrior like that. Killed by your tonsils. In any case, everybody's scrambling because who's going to replace Shirkuh? For the record, Shir means lion, Kuh means mountain. So his name was Lion Mountain. And then he took the laqab, the nickname, Asaduddin, Lion of Faith. So that was his name was Lion of Faith, Lion Mountain. Such a cool name. Everybody's scrambling trying to figure out who's going to replace him. And the guy they pick is none other than 31-year-old Salahuddin. And one of the reasons they picked him was they thought he was naive and they thought he was too young and they didn't think he had a power base because he just, he was the lieutenant for Shirkuh, but he just wasn't connected to the court in Damascus the way Shirkuh was. He wasn't connected even to his own soldiers the way Shirkuh was. So they thought he'd be easy to manipulate. So they make him the Wazir. And all of a sudden, Salahuddin goes from, he's somebody's aide-de-camp to he is on equal footing with Nur-ad-Din because Egypt is more powerful than Syria. Egypt had more money, it had more people, it had more resources, it had bigger trade balance. Like, there's no reason on earth in that moment to think that Egypt isn't at least the equal. And that's how Salahuddin gets his start. Nur-ad-Din is panicked because he knew Shirkuh was loyal. They were best friends. But he doesn't really know what Salahuddin's going to be like. And so he orders Salahuddin to get rid of the Fatimids because they're Shia. And because he's the Wazir, but there's still a Fatimid Khalifa. And he also orders Salahuddin to come to Damascus to basically pay homage, to show that he really is subservient to Nur-ad-Din. And Salahuddin keeps making up excuses why he can't go to Damascus and why he won't overthrow the Fatimid Khalifa. It takes Salahuddin about 2 years before he finally does overthrow the Fatimid Khalifa. And then he continually refuses to meet with Nur-ad-Din. Salahuddin does 2 military expeditions against the Crusaders, and both times Nur-ad-Din finds out about it and sends an army from Syria to go he leads an army. His goal is to meet Salahuddin in Palestine since Salahuddin won't come to Damascus. And both times Salahuddin retreats back to Egypt. And both times Nur-ad-Din goes, what did you do that for? We were going to meet up and we were going to defeat these Crusaders. And both times Salahuddin has an excuse. The first one, he said, I had to deal with a rebellion. It's true. He had to deal with a rebellion, but he could have met with Nur-ad-Din and then turned around and dealt with the rebellion. And the second time he said, my dad was sick, but he didn't find out until he got back to Egypt that his dad was sick. So that's not the reason he did it. He did it because he was worried that if he paid homage to Nur-ad-Din, it would make it real. As long as he didn't meet with him, they were kind of on equal footing. By 1174, Nur-ad-Din became convinced that Salahuddin was planning a rebellion against him and was going to break, the state that Nur-ad-Din had created. And he got an army together, and he was going to march through Crusader territory to go put down Salahuddin. And just as they're about to march, he had a tonsillitis, and it killed him. And Nur-ad-Din dies in 1174. So for those of you who get a sore throat, go to the doctor, because apparently it's really dangerous.
Okay, give me a sense. I mean, before we talk about Salahuddin sort of consolidating power, give me a sense of how he got rid of the Fatimids. I mean, specifically, because I mean, I think we're going to now spend a bit of time speaking about him and his behavior and the kind of the legacy he leaves. And I've heard, and I personally, when I go into the history myself, I get conflicting reports over the extent of atrocity or non-atrocity when he actually dealt with the Fatimids. So just deal with that briefly. That's more to sort of scratch my own itch, right?
Right.
But then also, how does he then consolidate power and sort of change the dynamics? Because it's not like he just marches on Jerusalem. There's a change in the dynamics of power and how the states kind of look at each other for that period just before he does. So yeah, all yours.
Yeah, so in 1171, it's a little unclear because there's conflicting reports, like you said. So I'm going to go with what I think makes the most sense based on everything else. It looks to me like Salahuddin actually had the last Fatimid Khalifa poisoned. And as the man is slowly dying, because apparently they didn't give him a particularly nasty, lethal dose. They gave him a poison that would kill him slowly. As he was slowly dying, he kept begging to meet with Salahuddin. And, Salahuddin had been his vizier for 2 years at that point. And the man was young. I want to say he was 21, maybe? He might have been 20. And so he keeps asking for Salahuddin. It takes him about 2 weeks to die. Salahuddin never met with him. And later on, Salahuddin said that was one of his biggest regrets. So to me, it's unclear. Was his big regret that he poisoned him, or was it his big regret that he didn't meet with him, or was it both? But it turns out that all the Khalifa wanted was for Salahuddin to promise to take care of his children. So the fact that Salahuddin doesn't meet with him is kind of, you could see how that would bother him a little bit. So Salahuddin definitely did some brutal stuff from time to time. It looks like he's the guy who killed Shawar. It looks like he's the guy who killed the last Fatimid Khalifa. It's not, he's not always this good guy that I think we always try to make him out to be, especially in his early years. There is an uprising of Mamluk. Mamluk means owned. And so there was in addition to Turkish, Kurdish, and Arab free soldiers, there was also an army a slave army. And that slave army basically was, you were captured in battle, you were offered the opportunity to convert to Islam and become a Mamluk. So that army would have had blue-eyed blonde Normans running around with names like Roger, and it would have had, blacks from Nubia who had been enslaved and brought into that army, and Arab slaves and Turkish slaves and Kurdish slaves. Like, it would have been the ultimate cosmopolitan army of slaves. And there was a slave uprising, and Salahuddin put it down, and he was rather ruthless with it. And that uprising, apparently the units were primarily Nubian, so they were primarily black. So I think a frequent name for the thing is like the Black Uprising or the Black Rebellion. In any case, Salahuddin, when Nuruddin dies, Salahuddin has a really interesting set of options, because right after Nuruddin dies, Amalric dies, the king of Jerusalem. I think it was 2 months later. And when Amalric dies, by the way, he died of dysentery. So just be really careful with your gut. Your gut will kill you, it turns out, whether it's the top or the bottom. Amalric dies, and so there's now chaos in the kingdom of Jerusalem. There's chaos in Syria. There's no leadership in either country. Both places are trying to figure out what's next. And Salahuddin needs to make a choice. His first option is attack the kingdom of Jerusalem right now while it's reeling from the death of its king. His second option would be to attack Syria and try and annex it. But he realizes if he attacks Syria, then he looks like the villain. So he doesn't want to attack it. And he's worried that if he attacks the kingdom of Jerusalem while Syria is not stable, he won't have support from the north. For all he knows, the Syrians will side with the kingdom of Jerusalem against him. So he decides to do nothing. And he actually sits on it. There was a Turkish general who was in charge of Aleppo, He runs to Damascus. He captures in Damascus the son of Nuruddin and brings him by force back to Aleppo and says, I'm the guy in charge. I'm his regent. I'm in charge of figuring this kid's future out. And then he takes an army back to Damascus a few weeks later to capture the city. So the military commander in Damascus sends word to Salahuddin and says, I'm begging you to come stop the siege and save our city. And so Salahuddin takes a very small force. They sneak through Crusader territory. They arrive in Damascus. It's enough to scare away the Atabeg of Aleppo. They enter the city, and there's confusion because the guy who's in control of the citadel doesn't immediately hand over the city. At that point, Salahuddin's brother climbs the wall and then sticks Salahuddin's banner on the citadel wall. And so everybody goes, wait, did we capture the citadel? And in the confusion, the gates open and Salahuddin marches in. And he captures Damascus without any bloodshed. And in that moment, then he's seen as the liberator of Syria as opposed to the guy who attacks it. So it was genius waiting for somebody to basically beg him to come. Once that happens, then every step he takes afterwards is to try and get Aleppo. Because once he has Aleppo, he knows he'll have the Crusader state surrounded on both sides. And he's working towards that. It takes him quite a few years. By 1180, he has Aleppo. But also, he does something really interesting. There's a new king. The new king was Baldwin IV. So Baldwin IV had leprosy. He was the leper king. He became king as a teenager. By 1180, he's finally an adult, but barely. Salahuddin goes to him and says, do you want to just do peace? We could just end the war right here, right now. You guys keep Jerusalem. You keep the coast. You keep Antioch and Tripoli. You keep Jaffa, Akka, Sur, all of it. The coast is yours. But we stop fighting each other. And Baldwin IV goes, this is amazing. Let's do it. They sign a peace treaty and they end the conflict. Just like that. It's done. Except it's not, obviously.
So what happens? What happens? Why? How is that? How is the treaty? Who doesn't live up to the treaty, and how is it broken?
Okay, so the basis of the treaty was anytime Christian pilgrims want to go to Jerusalem, they can. They will have safe, free passage. There's nothing. Nobody will ever mess with them. The kingdom of Jerusalem will keep Jerusalem. Like everything is intact the way it is. All that has to happen is no more raids on caravans, no more attacks on cities, no attempt to expand territory. So lock down the borders right where they are. So there was a guy named Renaud de Chatillon. Renaud de Chatillon was just brutal bastard. He ends up marrying Alice's daughter, Constance, and becomes the Prince of Antioch. At one point, he decides he's really bored just being the Prince of Antioch. He invades and conquers and massacres, pillages, and plunders Cyprus. Cyprus belonged to the Roman Empire. On paper, the Principality of Antioch belongs to the Roman Empire. So one Roman province just attacked another Roman province and sacked it. He ends up laying on his belly, begging the Roman emperor not to punish him. The Roman emperor decides to forgive him. I wouldn't have, but the Roman empire forgives him. And he continues to do stuff, crazy stuff. Ultimately, he gets captured and gets imprisoned by Nuruddin. He's in prison in Aleppo. And by the way, Nuruddin captured a bunch of Crusader rulers. He captured Raymond III, Bohemond III. He captured Jocelyn III. Like, he has all these Crusaders in prison in Aleppo. It's like this giant... almost the entire Crusader leadership is in Aleppo at one point in prison. When Nuruddin dies, the Turkish Atabeg of Aleppo is desperate for funding, and 1176 sells Renaud de Chatillon back to the Crusader states. And I don't remember the sum of money, but it was a significant sum. It's not enough for him to survive, Salahuddin eventually takes over Aleppo, and the guy is ultimately killed. But Renaud de Chatillon then is given Kerak in what is today Jordan. And Renaud de Chatillon refuses to let the peace stick in. So Renaud de Chatillon is the mastermind of the Battle of Montgisard. 1 year after he's freed from prison, he had been in prison for almost 2 decades. 1 year afterwards, he leads the Crusader army against Saladin, and they beat the Salahuddin's army like it's a catastrophe, it's a massacre. So 3 years later, when the peace happens, he's like, no, I'm not doing this. And he begins raiding, and he's attacking caravans, he's attacking pilgrims heading to Mecca. And then he decides that's not enough. He builds a fleet in Aqaba, and he attacks several forts in Egypt. And then he starts heading towards the coastal region, so Anbu area, because he's on his way. What he wants to do is land near Anbu and go all the way, am I saying Anbu? Yanbu. And then he wants to go all the way to Medina, because he wants to dig up the Prophet Muhammad's bones and take them back to the Crusader states. When Saladin left his brother as the governor of Egypt, when he realizes what's happening, he takes the Egyptian fleet and they chase down Renaud's fleet and they capture it. They sink the fleet, they capture it, they stop this from happening. But now Salahuddin's incensed. He's like, dude, what are you doing? You were going to go dig up our prophets? Like, he can't imagine it. And it breaks his mind. And he basically, at that point, begins to operate under the assumption that the treaty is over. And he puts Kerak under siege. Baldwin IV shows up, and he begs Salahuddin to let him punish Renaud de Chatillon. And ultimately, Salahuddin says, okay, fine, we'll put the peace treaty back in, but Renaud has to stop. And he won't. He continues to attack caravans. And so eventually by 1187, Salahuddin believes there's no option, but he has to put down the Kingdom of Jerusalem. But for 7 years, he tried to make peace work. And it just wasn't going to happen. Renaud wasn't going to allow it.
Okay, so just, we don't have enough time, but I think we need to speak about the Battle of Hattin just for a while before we speak about the actual fall of Jerusalem. We can be very brief about it, but just what happens next? So how does this battle come about, and how does that sort of culminate in Jerusalem going back to the former sort of Muslim / Arab / not Crusader empire?
Yeah, so Saladin decides that he needs to lure the Crusader army into a trap. And what he does is he attacks Tiberias. It's on the Sea of Galilee. And Tiberias, the city was through marriage owned by Raymond III, who was the Count of Tripoli. And the goal then is capture Tiberias and draw the Crusader army to Galilee to fight. When this happens, Raymond III goes to the Crusader king, who's now a guy named Guy de Lusignan. And the reason it's Guy is because Baldwin IV finally dies from the leprosy. It killed him. And so his sister had married this idiot named Guy. And so now King Guy, which is a hard thing to say without cracking a smile, is taking the Crusader army to Tiberias to recapture it. And Raymond III is like, don't do this. This is stupid. This is Saladin set up a trap. I don't mind that I've lost Tiberias. Let him have it. We don't need to do this. And Guy's like, I hate you so much. I want to attack and fall into a trap just to not do what you're telling me to do. So that's the level of petty these guys were operating at. And so they go to Hattin. So the Sea of Galilee is actually a lake, freshwater lake. And what Salahuddin had done was he had messed up one of the watering holes that the Crusaders were going to use. And so it was producing very little water. So they went from one watering hole to this one that they had been planning on using that didn't have enough water. And then their only option was to either turn around or get to the Sea of Galilee and basically drink from this lake because they're running out of water. And Saladin parks his army in, there's these two ancient volcanoes. They look like horns sticking up in the air. He parks it in between so that the Crusader army has to fight their way through these horns to get to the other side. Raymond takes his army plus the army that was brought in by Antioch, and they go charging in. They fight their way through Salahuddin's army. They reach the lake, they get their fresh water, and then they turn and they run as fast as they can, and they get back to Lebanon. They abandon the Crusader army completely. So Raymond III was like, we shouldn't fight this, it's a trap, and he flees. The rest of the army spends the whole day trying to get to the Sea of Galilee. They just can't do it. At one point, the men start climbing up onto the horns because they just don't know what else to do. And so King Guy has to run around trying to get the men off the horns so they'll fight. And eventually they have to surrender. And it was a catastrophic event because the Crusader army, the vast majority of it is now under Salahuddin's possession. The king and a bunch of the leadership. Balian of Ibelin had escaped. And I said Raymond III escaped. Raymond, the son of Bohemond III of Antioch, escaped. So there's some guys that got away, but the majority were captured. And then that's where, including Renaud de Chatillon, that's where there's the famous moment where Salahuddin offers a glass of ice water to Guy de Lusignan, and Guy takes his drink and then starts to offer it to Raymond, and Salahuddin knocks it out of his hand and says, I didn't offer it to him. And then he draws his sword and kills Renaud right there. He stabs him. And what was customary is if you offered a prisoner water, it was your way of saying, I will spare you, I won't kill you. That's why it was so important for Salahuddin to knock the water out of his hand. But of course, Guy thinks he's next, and then Salahuddin has to explain, no, you already drank water, I'm not going to kill you. And then he says, kings don't kill kings. And then, of course, Guy's marveling at the fact that they have ice water in August, and he can't figure out how they have ice. There's this thing called mountains, and the ice is on the top of them. Anyway. At that point, then, Salahuddin has to make a serious set of choices. So if you look at some of the choices Salahuddin had made up until that point, there are moments where he was not very merciful. In this moment, he suddenly becomes extremely merciful. And he has to negotiate with his army. His army wants to massacre the entire Crusader army. He's like, no, I don't want to do this. I think this would be a terrible idea. They compromise. They're gonna massacre the Templars, the Hospitallers, not the commander of the Templars, by the way, but everybody else. Salahuddin refuses to massacre the commander. And then the Turcopoles. So the Turcopoles were horse archers who fought in the Arab style, but fought for the Crusaders. And Salahuddin hated that because he was halfway convinced that many of those men were actually Muslims who had converted to Christianity. And so he saw them as traitors. So he wanted them killed, but he didn't want the Templars and Hospitallers killed. So what he did was he had his men who spoke Latin run over to the Hospitallers and Templars and start telling them, if you convert to Islam, we won't execute you. And so a group of them, 10, 15, 20% of them actually convert. They had been religious fanatics up until that moment, and suddenly they realized, nope, they were Muslims in their heart, and they convert and become Mamluk and save their lives. I think what happened was the following. I think Salahuddin realized that the only way to get the Crusaders to stop was to keep showing them mercy. That the violence of defeat would set off another crusade. That if you kept beating them and being rough with them, the trauma would heap on top of the trauma, and they would keep doing this. But if you were merciful and tried to free as many as possible, it would erode away at their trauma, and little by little they would start to calm down. And so his strategy from that point on, from 1187 to his death in 1193, was to every chance he got, just be merciful and avoid being brutal.
Okay, so how does he eventually take Jerusalem?